Hello, Applewhite Dental team. This is Gary Johnson, president of Wild Institute, coming to you through a webinar. And we're going to get into how to connect with team and with clients, with customers, with guests, with patients, with people in general. We're going to get into what that looks like really over a 4-part series, similar to how we did it last time, where we're going to take a particular topic, really chew on that, talk about how it relates to the practice. But here's one of the things we're going to do a little bit differently. I'm making this webinar specifically for you guys. And as a facilitator in your office, if you've been tasked with being your team's facilitator, all you have to do to prepare for this meeting is just follow along as though you're live in the audience. I will give you guys instructions as we go. I'll turn off the camera and say, you guys talk about this, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of discuss it. And then at the end, I'll give some feedback as well. These topics we're getting into over the next 4 weeks are really focused on, as I mentioned earlier, connecting. And each video will be approximately 30 minutes, along with what I would recommend is at least 45 minutes of discussion afterwards. In order to get the most out of these webinars, you can't just watch them once and then hope that behavior is going to change or that things will change. Will it make a difference? Sure. But the best way to make a difference is to ensure that the concepts and ideas that we talk about in here are discussed as a team, and then you as a team decide how to implement those ideas or what ideas make sense for your practice. So with that said, we're going to jump in and get started. As you can see here on the screen, how to connect with your team and customer, your team and your patients, what we're going to get into today. This particular topic is based on, the research is based on 2 books. The first one, as you can see listed here, is a book called Just Listen. It was written by Dr. Mark Goulston. He is a clinical psychiatrist, one of the most highly respected experts on connectivity out there. And I mean, think about it. If you're hired by the FBI to train hostage negotiators, you obviously better know how to connect with people. And that's one of the things he's an expert at. So we're going to have some research in today's event as well as over the next 3 weeks based on Dr. Goulston's research. Trains all types of organizations, as I mentioned, including the FBI. We're also going to have Winning with People, the book Winning with People, written by one of the world's greatest experts on leadership, John C. Maxwell. Hopefully you've heard of him. If you have not, his most famous book is arguably the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. Just a fascinating, outstanding book. If you're an office manager in the audience or you're a field coordinator, I strongly recommend you read it. There's just some phenomenal information to glean from that book. And he, as I mentioned, is an acclaimed expert and has written multiple books. I don't know how many he's written at this point, 20 or 25 maybe. But his book, Winning with People, will also be used in today's data. So what I'm sharing with you today is not my opinion. It is based on research from these 2 authors as well as from other sources and publications that I've had the opportunity to read. So with that said, I want to jump in and give you today's agenda. Let me move this over a little bit so you can see this better, and I'll blow. I think that's probably big enough for me. Principle number 1, the thing we're going to get into this week, is we must first understand other people before we ever try to be understood. If you really want to be a great connector of people, not just a great communicator. What I'm doing right now is communicating, and I communicate and clearly and articulate well, and that's all well and good, but that does not necessarily mean that I'm going to connect with you or the audience. So we're going to get into what connecting looks like today. And in order to be a great connector, principle number 1 that we'll cover is we must first seek to understand others before we ever worried about being understood. This will take us approximately 30 minutes in video content, somewhere in that ballpark. And then what I'll ask you to do, facilitators in the audience, I'll ask you just to follow my instructions as we go. We'll make it real simple. If there's a particular question I want you guys to ponder, I'll say, okay, guys, talk about this question. Then I'll turn my camera off. I will then wait 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it might be, and then come back on and say, okay, let's talk about this. So the good news for you is you don't have to worry about pausing anything. You'll just follow along as though you're live in the audience. I then recommend about 45 minutes, as I think we've talked about before. In order to really make this thing work well, I think you need to have about that much time to really dig into the dialogue. So we're gonna suggest that you do that as well. So that being said, here's where I want to start. So this will be one of these opportunities for you guys to break out and discuss this. Now, I know most of you have been working together for a very long time, and you're going to know the answer to a lot of these things right up front. But here's what I want you to do. I want you, when I say go, don't start yet. When I say go, I want you to look at the person next to you, tell them what your middle name is once, tell them your mother's maiden name once, tell them the name and age of your children or pets once. You can't repeat it. They can't write it down. You're simply going to do this one time. They're going to receive your information. Then once they've received your information, that person's then going to turn to you and do the very same thing. I am going to give you 2 minutes or so. That's all you have to do this exercise. So you're going to have 2 minutes to do it. I'm going to turn the camera off. And then when I say go, you guys are going to go through this exercise. Okay? So here we go. Are you ready? Go. Okay, stop. So hopefully that gave you enough time for each one of you to share that information. Now here's what I'm going to ask you to do next. You've both been given that information. You know that we're talking about connecting, so you think you already know what I'm going to do next, which you're right. I'm going to ask you now to repeat back that information to the person that gave it to you and see how you did at capturing what they said. So go ahead and do that right now. I'll give you a minute or so to do that, then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, stop. How did you guys do at capturing that information? I know most of you in the room probably did pretty well at that for 2 reasons. One, you guys have been working together quite a long time, I'm sure, most of you in most offices. 2, you knew as soon as I told you that today's event was an event about connecting and communicating, and that you knew one of the authors of the book that we were using as research wrote a book called Just Listen. I'm sure you were doing a better job of listening than normal, right? So most of you out there felt like you did a pretty good job. Some of you, though, even though you knew all that, still did a poor job of capturing that information. Why is that? What's the point of that exercise? The point is, what if you walked into a room that we weren't in a seminar on how to communicate or connect. It was a party, it was an event, and somebody came up and introduced himself that didn't know you and mentioned that same information. How do you think you would be doing at remembering it? If you're being honest with yourself, you would say, not very good. And the reason for that, and the point of that exercise, is what Dr. Goulston says. He says that we're really, really bad listeners. He said, not only are we bad at listening, but in addition to that, we start to form opinions based on interactions with people that cloud our ability to listen and cloud our brain's ability to see something different than the perception you have created of that person. So that's kind of a powerful, powerful thing to think about if you think about yourself and how you interact with others. For example, I know you guys have been through exercises like this before. So I'm going to ask you to look at this picture here on the screen, and you guys all see this picture. And in your mind, I want you to think about what this picture represents to you. What does it look like? And some of you in the room are already saying, well, I think this looks like a bird. I think it's a bird, some kind of a bird. And most other people are saying, yeah, I see a bird because, you know, there's its eye and there's its head and then there's its beak and it's got a little tongue in there. And everybody says, oh yeah, that's I see the bird. And then there's others of you in the audience that say, no, you know what, I kind of think I see a rabbit. And when you say, well, how do I see a rabbit? Well, if I turn this picture, right, and I turn it like this, now all of a sudden I have a rabbit. I have his eyeball, and I have his nose right here and his ears, right? So it's kind of a clever exercise, and where that comes from, where that particular exercise comes from is from a book in 1962 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And you guys have seen stuff like that before. But the point of it, when it was put into this book, was talking about paradigms in science where people that are studying something, a hypothesis, clearly can see those things that line up with their hypothesis, clearly from 3 miles away. But something that does not line up with their hypothesis could be sitting in the room right next to them and weigh 800 pounds and they just don't see it. They don't see it, ladies and gentlemen, physiologically. The studies have shown us that. That's amazing when you think about it. So what's the point of this exercise? What if this really was a rabbit, not a duck? You thought it was a duck and you threw it in the lake and said, be free. We'd have a problem. That rabbit would drown. You would have a major, major issue. So my point in presenting you with this little interesting exercise is to talk to you about where we as people let paradigms or perceptions really cloud the way we interact with others. And that's really where I wanted to take you next. I want you to tell me the answer to this question. Does the way we perceive someone impact the way we interact with them? Does it? And that's almost a rhetorical question. I know what all of you are going to say. Oh, yes, of course it does. The way we perceive someone. If I came onto this webinar and I had my head was all tatted up and I had a big giant bull ring in my nose and I had big giant earrings coming off, and you would judge me. You would have a perception of me, whether you thought you were right or you were wrong. You most likely could be wrong. I mean, I could be an expert on a particular topic and you would judge me based on the way I look. So perception absolutely can create a perception for us, the way we see people, how we see them can create a perception that can impact the way we interact with them. So what about listening to them? Does it impact your willingness to listen? I don't know how many of you out there in the audience have seen the commercial. I don't remember which financial organization it is or which stockbroker, but they take a guy and they dress him up in a suit and put him in a boardroom with some clients, and he's all dressed nice and his hair's cut and he's talking. He has a few words, he knows what to say right, and says, would you trust me as your financial advisor? And they all say, oh yeah, I trust you. And then at the end he says, well, you shouldn't, because I'm a DJ and I know nothing about numbers. And they show a video of him with his hair and dreadlocks. And what's my point? My point is, they based their feelings on how he looked and a few of the words that he used that made them feel like, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. So your ability to relate to people is 100% impacted by how you perceive them. So here's what I want you to do as a group. I'm going to break you back into teams. And if you're out there, if you haven't broken into teams yet, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to to break into teams of 3 or 4 people. And if that's as many as you have in your audience, great. But I want you to break into teams of 3 or 4. And then the person that has the lead will be the leader is the person with the most pets, okay? And the person with the most pets will be your little group's team leader. And here's what you're going to do, team leaders. Let's figure that out real quick. Let's take a few seconds, figure out who that person is. I know you're all talking about that now. Just a real quick second. Let's figure out who the person is with the most pets. You guys do that real quick, and then I will tell you where to go from there. Okay, hopefully you guys have figured that out. So we know now who are team leaders. Team leaders, here's your job. Your job today is when I give these team breakout discussions, you're going to talk amongst each other. And then the team leader is going to be the person that's going to write down some of the things that you've said that were causing whatever, or the answers to whatever question I give you, or causing a feeling, or whatever I might ask you about. Okay, so you're going to write those things down. And then you're going to share some of those things with each other, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it. When I say share it, each team leader is going to give 1 or 2 things on your list to the rest of the group in terms of what you heard. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to say discuss it. I'll come back and say, once I've said discuss it as a team, I will come back and say, tell each person in your office, each team leader, what your 1 or 2 ideas are. So just follow along with me. So here's what I want you to do next. Break into team discussion. Here's what I want the answer to, what's on the screen. What things cause you to create a perception or an impression of someone? You've got about 3 minutes to do this. Break into discussion and talk about it. Then we'll come back and I will tell you what to do with your list next. Just get your list built, what your team said. Ready? Go. Okay, everybody, stop. Stop. I know that's not a ton of time. I gave you a couple minutes there to discuss things that can cause us to create a perception or impression of someone. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm only going to give you a minute or so next. And all I want you to do in that minute, because we're going to discuss these things together, is I want each team leader to simply state what were 1 or 2 ideas that you guys put down in terms of what causes you to create a perception. We'll talk about them together, but I'm going to give you a minute or so for each one of you to give 2 of your ideas that you guys wrote down. So I want you guys to do that right now, just a minute. All I want you to do is say, hey, here's what we said, here's one thing, here's another. Next team leader will do the same, and then in less than a minute, I'll come back. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, stop. So we're going to talk about this together. We're going to talk about some of the things that probably came up in your discussions as we go here. And when I ask that question, I ask you to consider, what kind of things that you're hearing out there cause us to form an impression. Some things that I typically hear, things like the words that people use, their vocabulary. Vocabulary definitely could be something we use to form an impression of others. That comes up a lot. Vocabulary can also tell us or cause us to judge someone's education. So someone's education is another thing that comes up as something that causes us to form a perception of someone. The way they dress, we talked about that earlier. Their clothes is another way that we form an impression of people. The way they carry themselves, so their body language, their posture, those are things we use to form an impression. The way someone smells, that's a big one, the good or bad. You guys all know how that goes. The guy that poured an entire bottle of Polo on before he came in, you could smell him in the parking lot. Or the opposite, that they don't smell real good, we judge that. We judge people's smiles, of course, in the business that you're in, we do that. All those things. Parenting, how someone parents their children, we judge that based on experiences we've had with their kids. The type of car they drive, where they went to school, how old they are, what color their skin is, whether they're a male or they're a female. What's my point? My point is there are all kinds of things that we will look at and within less than 10 seconds form an impression of someone. But the most powerful thing that causes us to form an impression of others, according to John C. Maxwell in his book, Winning with People, is how we see others. Or how we see ourselves is how we see others. How we are, how we see ourselves determines how we see other people. Think about that for a second. Excuse me. My own self-perception, how I feel about me, is the greatest influencer of how I feel about you. So when we think about that, if we're not very self-aware, if we don't know that that's what naturally happens, we could find ourselves, judging other people and not really sure why we're doing that. I want to walk through this with you. I think it's very, very powerful information. I'm going to share with you what John C. Maxwell states in his book, Winning with People, are the 5 things that cause us to, I'm going to move this out of the way, that cause us to form an opinion of others. First one is genetics, our genes. And today we probably can't do a whole lot about that. In 20 or 30 years that might change. But today our genetics, our genes are the most powerful things, one of the most powerful things in terms of how we kind of perceive other people is our genetics. And it's one thing, quite honestly, we just can't change it. At least we can't today. Maybe in 20 to 30 years we can, but we can't now. According to Maxwell, the second thing, which I already talked about when I put the big picture up here of how we see ourselves, is our self-image. And that was where I led with this. Our self-image is one of the greatest things that causes us to form an impression of other people, is how we see ourselves. Half the harm that's done in the world is due to people that are wanting to feel important. Think about the countries around the world that are threatening harm and violence on people. Why are they doing that? Many of them are doing that because they want to feel important. People with a negative self-image will expect the worst, damaged relationships and find others who are similarly negative. People with a positive image, on the other hand, will expect the best, are likely to be successful, and gravitate towards other successful people. We as humans tend to feel most comfortable with people whose self-esteem level resembles our own. So when I mention those 2 things to you, think about that. They're powerful, powerful things. What about this? Maxwell talks about the experiences in life. And I'm going to change this story up. It says the story of the young shepherd. I'm going to change this up to the story of Bella, because I think all of you will relate to this better. People will respond to what they're prepared to believe. Let me tell you about Bella. So several months ago, my wife and I were participating in an event at a friend's home where 4 or 5 couples got together on Monday nights to socialize and discuss things from our church. It was a church event. And we get together and we talk about that. And it was hosted at one particular house every week. And I'm a huge dog lover. I love dogs. And this particular home that hosted the event had 2 dogs. One that just loved me to death and would come sit on my lap and let me pet her. A little long-haired schnauzer, or long-haired dachshund. You guys know how cute they are. The little wiener dogs, long-haired, just adorable. Her name is Colby, just a sweet dog. And they had another dog that was named Bella that was a rescue dog. And Bella, just to give you an idea what she looked like a kind of a miniature German Shepherd, but was solid black, and she was miniature size, maybe 40 or 50 pounds, and had the silkiness. Her coat had the silkiness of a Labrador, so just a beautiful black coat. And no matter what I did, Bella wanted nothing to do with me, and I love dogs, and it was driving me crazy. And we went back and forth to their home, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks in a row, and every week I would try to figure out a way to get her to interact with me. And it started off when I would walk in the room, she'd be standing on the other end of the room. And by the way, folks, it was only me. It was only me that she was that way with. But she would see me as I walked in the room, and she'd growl at me from the other end of the room. She'd be 30 feet away, and she'd growl. So by week after week, I continued to try to figure out how could I just was determined to get her to like me, to the point where I would start bringing treats with me, and I would sit on the floor and I wouldn't look at her, and I'd hold the treat out, and she would gingerly sneak up, and you know what she'd do? She'd kind of do these, and she'd grab the treat and she'd run away. So no matter what I did, I could not get this dog to connect with me. Now let's talk about this for a minute. Is it possible that that dog, who was a rescue dog, could have been owned by someone who looked like me, who treated her poorly? Is that possible? I think it's possible. I think that's something that can happen. We're going to talk, a little bit more about that when we get into hurting people hurt people in our next event. But it's very possible that she was prepared to respond to what she was prepared to believe, which was, I look like something that hurt her in the past. Experiences in life, ladies and gentlemen, can 100% cloud the way in which we perceive other people. It's something really important for us to think about. Think about that. People will respond to what they're prepared to believe. Other things, number 4, that about those experiences can be important. Things like our attitude, how we decide to respond to those experiences in life is an attitude. We decide that. We decide to be happy or sad or reluctant or expectant or open-minded or closed-minded. Attitude, ladies and gentlemen, was the number 4 issue in the top 5 things John Maxwell listed that cause us to perceive other people. Attitude, our own attitude about those experiences we've had in our life. And listen, ladies and gentlemen, every single person sitting in this audience has had something bad happen to them. Every single person. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry those bad things happen. But you have to make a decision on what you're going to do with those bad experiences. Are you going to compartmentalize those? And are you going to learn lessons from those bad experiences and move on? Or are you going to dwell on them and be a victim the rest of your life? My wife has a friend whose mother lost her, who's in her late 70s now, who lost her husband very early in her marriage, a few years in. And you know what she did? She canceled the rest of her life. She then led the rest of her life, the next 50 years, as a bitter, crabby person who saw the glass half empty for the rest of her life. And that's how she interacted with the people in her life. And today she's a lonely woman living in a nursing care facility by herself, and nobody visits her. And it's one of those things, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to decide. Bad things happen. What are we going to do with that? Are we going to compartmentalize it and move on? Or are we going to let it cloud the rest of our life in the way we interact with people? Last point Maxwell brings up is friends. Positive people that impact the way we perceive others is the people that we associate with. Positive people with good character will help to lift us up. Please avoid the Lucys in life. Those of you out there in the audience who are young are going, who's Lucy? Those of you my age will understand I'm talking about Charlie Brown. And Lucy was the character that would always hold the football for Charlie Brown and promise him she wouldn't move the football away when he went up to kick it. And what did she do every time? Every single time he went to kick the ball, she would pull the ball away and Charlie would fall down. Avoid the Lucys in life. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't interact with people that are less off than you, or you shouldn't interact with people that need your help or that are different than you. What I'm suggesting to you is don't let people drag you down. There are certain people in the world that just want to do that. They want to do that. The difference between who you are today and who you'll be in 5 years will be the people you spend time with and the books that you read. We have to rewire ourselves for listening. And what I want to do here, and this particular first seminar is going to go over 30 minutes. We're at about 30 minutes now. I'm going to need you for about another 8 to 10 minutes. So this first video will go a little bit longer than some of the others. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to tell me what it is that great listeners do. So I want you to break back into table discussions, and I want you to tell me what do great listeners do. Every one of you in the audience has somebody in your life that you look to when you really have something that's important to talk about. And you go to this person to talk to them for very specific reasons, one of which is they tend to be great listeners. Tell each other in your groups, what is it that those great listeners in your life do? Will you guys talk about what great listeners do? And then whether it's making great eye contact or not interrupting, what are some of those things? I'm going to give you a couple minutes to discuss this, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, stop. I know that's not a ton of time, and I know a lot of you out there are still wrapping up discussions, but let's talk about what great listeners do. Usually when I'm in a live audience and I ask this question, I'll hear things like they don't interrupt. I'll hear things like they make great eye contact. I'll hear that they lean into the discussion. I'll hear that they're not distracted by cell phones or computers or other phones ringing or somebody walking in and changing the dynamic. They're 100% glued to you when you talk. They nod in affirmation as you say things. They repeat back certain things that you've said so that you know that they're listening. They might say something like, so what you're saying is, they'll say things like that. They'll respond in the conversation with, so how did that make you feel? Things like that are what great listeners do. They're engaged. They make eye contact. They don't interrupt us. They really, really focus in on us when we're talking. One of the things I've heard come up in many, many discussions when I've held these seminars is, oh, well, they give me great advice. They tell me the truth. And I'm going to tell you to be very careful with that. What great listeners do more likely than give advice is actually when you ask, people will ask you, if you're a great listener, people will say, well, what do you think? And do you know what great listeners do? Instead of giving their advice or their opinion, they'll turn it back around to you and say, well, what do you think? And 99 out of 100 times, the person that asked them the question will say, well, this is what I think. And they'll go right into what they think. And they'll say what's really on their mind. And at the end of the discussion, they'll look at you and say, gosh, thank you for that great advice. And all you really did was turn it back around on them and ask them how they felt or what they thought. Every time they ask you that, they already have an opinion. Let them tell you what they feel. It's going to be much more powerful than for you just to give an opinion. So as I'm bringing all those things up, I want to make one last point about this first point of seeking to understand others before worrying about being understood. And that is listen to understand, not to respond. It's a really, really important point. And before I read the second point, I want to make this point. We as listeners or as interactors, as human beings. We can speak on an average rate of about 120 words a minute. We can listen at a rate of about 300 to 400 words a minute. And we can think at a rate of 1,000 words a minute. So one of the greatest dangers we have as communicators is somebody is speaking to me normally at a rate of 1/10 of what my brain can be thinking. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to miss one of the most important elements of that conversation because I'm thinking about something else. I love this quote. It's more important to be interested than interesting. And I'm going to share this last story with you before I give you your instructions on how to take next steps. But Dale Carnegie wrote a book, many of you have heard the name Dale Carnegie, called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And in that book, Dale describes back in the 20s or 30s when he wrote the book about a particular cocktail party that he was invited to go to. And keep in mind that when you were invited to a cocktail party back in the 20s or 30s, before there were even movies to really go see other than, silent movies, and there wasn't telephones like we have today, cell phones, and there wasn't the internet. If you got asked to go to a cocktail party, it was a really big deal. And he got asked to come to this party, and he was really excited. It was a big social event. He got all dressed up, and he goes to the party, and he gets into a conversation with a scientist. And the scientist is talking to him about things that Dale has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. So all he can do in this conversation is all the things that we just talked about that great listeners do. He listened, he nodded, he didn't interrupt. He reaffirmed some of the things the gentleman was saying as he went. He might have said in this entire conversation that lasted well over 30 minutes, he might have said 2 or 3 sentences full of information. He says in his book that a couple weeks later he got a letter in the mail from this person telling him what a great conversationalist he was. What's my point? It's more important to be interested than interesting. And surprisingly, the more interested you are, the more interested you become. So here's what I'm going to ask you guys to do next steps. Remember to be more interested than interesting. Constantly work on your listening skills. And I would love for you guys as a team to talk about what you're going to do to try to be better listeners, not only with each other, but with your patients. Facilitators, after you shut off this video, I'm going to ask you to break your teams back into groups, and I want them to highlight what things in particular stood out about this first component of connecting. What things was it? Was it how we perceive other people? Was it listening and how important that is to be a great listener? What things really stood out to them from this particular 35-minute, 40-minute video? And then what I want you guys to do, the most important thing, is I want you to talk about what you'll do differently as a practice as a result of this first principle. If you want to be a great connector, you must first be the person that's willing to connect. And connecting is most powerfully done when we are really, really careful not to form negative impressions of other people unfairly, and that we're willing to really be a great listener. So you guys talk about this. I will talk to you again next time. Thank you so much. Those of you that are facilitators, again, you're going to have an action plan. You're going to jot down the best ideas that your practice came up with and what you're going to do to implement those in your office to be a better connector. Thank you so much. Have a great week.